I think that is the updates for right now. There'll be more updates at the beginning after the break. So, right now we have the lovely Syrene, who is going to be speaking to us about Tantra and
healthy sexuality.
And healthy sexuality. I'm already feeling joyful in my nether regions. I hope you guys enjoy. Give a hand.
Hello, everybody. I'm here today. So, my name is Syrene. My birth name is Mira, and the reason that Tantrikas we change our name is because Tantra is about bringing in the divine, feminine, and masculine, right? So, as you bring in the divine feminine, which is Shakti, you put aside your ego, but you specifically bring in Shakti. And as you're doing this, you begin to create a relationship with Shakti, right? So this looks different for everybody. With men, it would be bringing in Shiva. So this is why we change our name. It's also why we kind of dress in a different sort of way. You know, this is my version of Shakti. So, but my journey started as a child. I come from a very spiritual family. My mother was a yogi, and she was one of the first generations of yogis. She learned directly from Desikachara, who was Krishnamacharya's son. My father was Cherokee, and he taught me various different spiritual techniques that were passed down from our tribe. My childhood started off extremely utopic, but then transformed from heaven into hell. I began to experience every form of abuse, including but not limited to sexual. When I was a young adult, I was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. So, yeah. Eventually, so the things I learned from childhood actually stayed with me and inspired me to seek out holistic methods towards recovery, and this sort of catapulted me, whether I wanted to or not, into this path, into this experience. So my exploration led me into shamanism and eventually led me to Tantra. I feel like a big part of what I'm doing as a healer is helping to balance sexuality between, men and women. So, what is Tantra? Tantra is the ancient science of sacred sexuality, but also how to balance and restore and manage our energy systems. So oftentimes when we think of Tantra, we only think of tantric sex, right? This is what we've been exposed to. In reality, Tantra is what's called the left-hand path. So it is about managing and learning the different energy systems within our body. These energy systems in Tantra are made up of 5 bodies. And there's lots of different philosophies around this, but this is the one that I like specifically. There's the idea of the physical body. That's where we're existing right now here, physically, in our bodies. The astral body, which is very similar to what we would consider consciousness, right? So it's the part that feels like us. It's the part that feels like our soul. And then there is the emotional body. So the emotional body is actually how we're taking in information, how we're understanding what's going on around us on an emotional level, and also how we're giving energy, right? We give energy out through our emotional body. Then there's the mental body. The mental body is the mind, right? So chi goes where the mind goes, right? Chi flows where the mind goes is the idea of Buddhism. So whatever you're thinking is what becomes reality. And then there's a casual body. So the casual body is just the idea of the unknown, emptiness, empty space that you can kind of manifest ideas or desires into. So the chakras, as they relate to the emotional body, basically are the emotional body, right? So whenever we're going through life and we're having different experiences, depending on what we experience, we actually end up taking that on in our chakra systems, right? So everybody knows there's the root, the sacral, the solar plexus, the heart, the throat, the third eye, and all of these things are imagining the emotional aspects of these regions of our bodies. And this we kind of know intuitively. We don't necessarily really need to read about it or, study it. We can study it literally by tuning in with ourselves and connecting in with these centers, right? So that's a lot of what Tantra is really actually about, is bringing your consciousness and moving it through your body to become aware of what you're actually feeling, right? So whenever there's a problem in your chakra systems, this is actually a block, right? So a lot of times this block comes in from the mental body, right? That could be the mental body, the physical body, the emotional body, the causal body, and they all interact and interchange together, and then they create, a blockage in your emotional body, and specifically your chakra systems. So the interesting thing too about chakras is that everything is male and female. So this idea of male and female comes in over and over again, the divine male and female, right? So the chakras are also male and female. The crown is yang, the brow is yin, the throat is yang, yang being male, yin being female, and so on and so forth. It goes, back and forth. This is sort of like a system to see what it is that is, more what divine feminine and masculine really is, right? So women are strong in the heart and the sacral and the brow, which is intuition, creativity, and love, right? Whereas men are strong in the root, the solar plexus, and the throat, and everybody's really kind of strong in the crown, I think, right? And I guess the crown. So, that means that's stability, strength, power, and communication, right? So these are the ideas of this divine aspect of male and female. So moving into the idea of Kundalini, the Kundalini is basically the idea of the energy of the Shakti energy that's stored in the root chakra, right? So when this energy is released, it travels up the nodes and it creates what's called a Kundalini awakening. A Kundalini awakening is literally like an alignment of all of your chakras, a quick alignment of all your chakras. There's one other thing that does this, and that's an orgasm. That's a physical orgasm. Will also align all of your chakras, right? So we can accomplish this in two different ways. We can accomplish this through spiritual practice, or we can accomplish this through physical practice, right? So when you accomplish this through physical practice, oftentimes you're exchanging energy with people, right? You're taking on their energy, you're fitting together, and sometimes that's good and sometimes that is bad, depending on what we're carrying with us. So, this idea of divine male and female continues, whereas the Shuma, I always say it's wrong, is actually like right in your spine, and it's the part that the energy or the nadis that travels up your chakras. But the Inda and Pinya is the male and female aspect again, right? So what actually creates what's called a Kundalini awakening or an orgasm is a balancing between the male and the female. So when the male and female aspects within yourself balance, this is when you kind of come to a higher place, because there's this idea of the twin flames, that we're all kind of one sex, like this is a dualistic universe, right? So in duality, we need the opposite in order to find spiritual enlightenment. But we can also find that within ourselves, right? We can draw that in from the universe. We can draw that in with intention. So moving on again with the idea of the divine Shiva and Shakti. So this idea of divine sexuality really has to do with transfiguration. It's called transfiguration in Tantra. And it's really about the process of lovemaking, where you invite the divine into the bedroom, but you also see the divine in that person that you're making love with, and they see the divine in you. So this again is like extremely important. What you're thinking, right? Where your mind goes is where the chi flows. So when you're thinking about something negative and you're making love to somebody, or you're thinking something badly about them, or you're thinking about how you're not happy, you're really not bringing in the divine, right? You're really not bringing in the best aspect. And this is actually going to block your pleasurable experience. It's going to block you from having a real blissful experience. The more positive energy that you're evoking, the more amazing your experience is going to be. So again, this idea of duality, right? Duality. Duality is something that exists all throughout nature. There's the idea of the high priestess, the idea of man and female becoming one, the negative and positive aspects of male, female, the yin and the yang. So there's positive duality. But, there's also what's kind of called negative duality. And negative duality is really a state where we get into such an extreme polarization that we can't find the middle ground, right? When there's pain that we're holding inside our chakras, this is creating such an imbalance that we go to extremes. We go to extremes emotionally, we go into black and white thinking, and we stop seeing clearly. We start acting emotionally, we start acting aggressively. So, that's not really good. It doesn't feel really good. It's kind of exactly what trauma feels like. So, in our society, this is kind of what we think of when we think of, this is what we're exposed to when we're, when we are talking about sexuality. There's really, the whore and the virgin, and there's marriage. And so, all this is just oppression at the end of the day, right? It's oppression and it's repression. And when you oppress something, when you try to oppress bliss or sexuality or positive feelings or emotions or your heart, what happens is you actually go to, again, extremes, right? So you're not experiencing sexuality from a place of a higher divine state. And I'm not talking about the Christian aspect of God, right? You're actually experiencing it from this extreme idea of either objectification or possession, right? So this is really not what sexuality is meant to be about. So this is the thing, is that in our society, is actually very, very yang. We're really yang obsessed, right? If you look at all the monuments in Washington, all this kind of stuff, they all look like penises, right? Like everything is structuralized in what we call left brain thinking, blocks of thinking stuck in your logical mind, right? And so what happens when a society is too yang is that the way that we express our sexuality becomes destructive without the balance and respect of the feminine. Why is this that this happens? Well, yang energy is fire, female energy is water. What happens when there's too much fire? Well, things burn down, it becomes destructive, right? Sex becomes aggressive and begins to treat people as objects. It treats sex as something to consume, right? So it's this very idea of like, I'm gonna go conquer the sex, right? I'm gonna take it. I'm gonna hunt it down or something, right? So what happens is that, when this happens, it shows itself in entertainment where, people actually become voyeurs. And what this does is it miseducates us in every way because it perpetuates an egoic perspective of what it comes to sex. So thinking about it in terms of what I want to conquer, what I want to get, thinking of it as terms of something that you can consume. Like, I picked this picture here specifically to show this idea of dominance, right? So that's actually really not a safe position. Like pushing down on something like that, you can hurt people's backs horribly. It's like people are a lot more delicate than we think that we are oftentimes, and we kind of just think that we can handle anything, and a lot of times we end up suffering for it. So I want to talk about the state of the ego and as it relates to sex. It creates a very separated state of being where people don't check in with each other. They are taught that sex is for them, for their own gratification, for their egos. Women then become victims. And this destructive yang energy actually shuts down and damages the sacral chakra. So, why does this damage the sacral chakra? Well, because the sacral chakra is actually balanced when you're in a state of positive giving and receiving, right? So balanced states of giving and receiving. When you're thinking about it as something to take, or you're thinking about egoic sex, you're actually staying in a place from your solar plexus. You're not supposed to have your consciousness in your solar plexus. Your solar plexus is actually, the consciousness is actually meant to be in the heart, right? This is the only chakra that gives energy, right? This chakra gives out energy. It's a feeding, nurturing, amazing energy, right? It's like the plants. There's a reason why the heart chakra is green and the plants are green, right? So when you are living your consciousness from your solar plexus, what happens is you actually are shutting down the rest of your chakra systems. They're not working in alignment. So, obviously this creates a lot of discord for people. The other thing about it as well is that when you're not giving and receiving properly, or when you're not clearing your emotional body or clearing your chakras, when you're coming to a person, you're actually fitting in to their ideas of their perspective of their traumas, right? So their experiences of what has harmed them in life, or how they believe life is bad or good or whatever, actually fits in perfectly with yours. And then you end up just kind of passing back and forth this negative concept of life, right? That really ends up not feeling very good. None of this stuff really feels very good, but we seem to be very, very, stuck in our ways in terms of the way that we continue to relate to sex. Not wanting to open up our heart chakras, not wanting to expand, our ideas of vulnerability. So, like I said before, the consciousness lives in the heart. And, so I want to talk about why it is that we have such an issue with vulnerability, right? We have this illusion that our emotions are weakness. And that, and the funny thing is that this is because in some ways we have this idea that the women are weak. And I'm sorry that I'm just going to say that, right? Because we come from our heart chakras. Women live in their heart chakras. Heart chakras are weak. Creativity is weak. Intuition is stupid, right? When you trust yourself, that's dumb, right? No, I'm saying when you just trust your intuition and you don't have some big explanation as to how you know everything in the world and, all this stuff, then you're dumb. Well, the thing is that vulnerability is actually extremely powerful. Vulnerability is going to help you find your own power. When you're stuck in this idea of being rigid and not being soft and being so strong and da-da-da-da-da, you're actually just lying to yourself. So, this is all kind of like, the negative aspects of our society and da-da-da-da-da. So how is it that we actually relieve ourselves from this influence that we have from our world, right? Well, a big way to do this is literally through Kundalini energetics. This is a way to really, and also any kind of meditation where you're allowing yourself to go and be vulnerable within yourself, when you're checking in with yourself, when you're putting aside the strategic mind, the logical mind to try to problem solve, when you just start going into your emotions, when you start going into your feelings, when you start touching in with the ground, when you start touching in with the sky, when you start paying attention to what's around you, when you stop thinking about what's happening in the future and move into a space of the now, right? So when you move into the space of the now and you're actually taking in all the beauty and all the pleasure and you're being honest within yourself, when you're touching yourself within your soul, you're connecting with your heart, you're connecting with your root, you're connecting with your crown, you're connecting with your idea of the divine. When you let go of this idea that you're alone in the universe, all you have to do is look around. These are all things that help evoke what's called bliss consciousness. When you have bliss consciousness, which everybody is capable of, right? You're just letting go. Stop fighting so hard to prove your point. Move into what it is that you're actually feeling. Pay attention to it. Forgive yourself. Forgive yourself. And that's almost all that you need, right? So I also want to talk about the idea of consecration. So Tantra teaches us that sex is sacred, and it teaches us how to check in with ourselves and each other. The joining of him and his partner is not just about him and his partner. It's actually about inviting the divine into the bedroom, right? So you're inviting the divine into the bedroom, and then you're also thinking of your partner as the divine aspect of himself or herself, right? And you're honoring each other in that way. The other thing that you're doing is that when you go into the bedroom with your partner, is that you offer the fruits of what it is that you're creating to the divine, right? So there's also a consciousness in terms of what it is that you do when you go into the bedroom, right? You're actually creating. When you're going into the bedroom, the reason this is such a sacred act is because this is where the divine and the physical meet. This is where male and female meets. This is where duality, the opposing forces of the universe, become one. This is how we create life here, right? So that's pretty sacred. But beyond it being sacred, it's not about being a Puritan, but it is about understanding what it is that you're asking for, right? So it's almost as if you're posing a question to the divine. What is it that I desire? Desire is actually a question to the divine. It's a question to the divine, it's a question to the self, and it's a question to the partner that you're with. So the other thing is that I want to talk about is this idea of union, right? So we have a lot of really ignorant ideas about what yoga means, about what Tantra means. Yoga actually means union. It does not mean what we think of as yoga, right? So yoga, asana is a state of movement. So yoga and asana is a state of union. It's a moving meditation, essentially, is what we're doing, but it's not yoga, right? The act of sacred sexuality is actually called what we call karma yoga, which means a selfless act to a path of enlightenment. So why is it a selfless act to engage in sexuality? Well, because that's the most beautiful way to do it.
Wasn't that fantastic?